Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We are going to give it just a minute or two for folks to log on, and then we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining. We will get started in just a minute to give folks a chance to log on. Thank you so much for being here. Hi, everyone. We are going to get started in just a couple seconds. Thank you for joining. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for being here. I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager with the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and this is, of course, our Housing First Working Group series, sponsored by NLIHC and our partners at the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Our organizations launched this series in response to misguided efforts on Capitol Hill and in communities across the nation to undermine housing first, to criminalize homelessness, and to impose punitive requirements on receiving housing assistance. These efforts will only make it harder for people to exit homelessness and find safe, stable housing in the long term. Today, our webinar will focus on the link between incarceration and homelessness and the vital importance of providing people exiting incarceration and those with conviction histories a safe, affordable home to return to. Housing is fundamental to public safety and to successful reentry for those exiting incarceration. An estimated 1 in 3 Americans has some kind of criminal record, and because of bias inherent to the criminal legal system, people of color, and particularly Black, Latino, and Native people, people with disabilities, and members of the LGBTQ community are disproportionately represented among impacted groups. Today, we are going to be joined by leading experts in reentry policy, service providers, and directly impacted advocates to learn more about the intersection of housing and reentry and how Housing First is a vital tool for successful reentry and community safety. First, we'll hear remarks from Representative Nanette Barragan, co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness and sponsor of the Returning Home Act, which would establish a grant program for community organizations to create demonstration programs that provide housing and services to people with conviction histories. Next, we'll be joined by Anna Bailey, Senior Policy Analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, who will set the stage for our conversation by providing a brief primer on mass incarceration and how carceral policies have impacted housing stability for millions. Then we'll delve into the bulk of our discussion with a panel on how Housing First supports people impacted by the criminal legal system. Our panelists for today include Dr. Richard Cho, Senior Advisor for Housing and Services at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, Veronica Lewis, Director of the Homelessness Outreach Program Integrated Care System in Los Angeles, California, Victoria Jennings, Supportive Housing Analyst at the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority, and Taylor Newbell, Founder and Executive Director of Who Speaks For Me. Before we get started, I did just want to lay out a couple ground rules. On today's webinar, like many of our Housing First webinars, we are going to be joined by people directly impacted by the issues that we're talking about. While questions regarding policy and programming are always welcome, audience members are expected to treat speakers with respect, and disrespectful language or inappropriate questions regarding the circumstances leading to someone's incarceration are not welcome and will not be tolerated. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce video remarks from Congresswoman Ninette Barragan. Congresswoman Barragan represents California's 44th District and is co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness, chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, and a member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. First elected to Congress in 2016, Representative Barragan has a dedicated history of pushing for policies that would invest in historically disinvested communities and ensure that everyone has a safe place to call home. Recently, she introduced the Returning Home Act, which would allocate $100 million through the Department of Justice to a new grant program to provide people exiting incarceration with up to 24 months of rental assistance and fund supportive services, including for pre-release planning and housing placement support. We will turn now to Representative Barragan's remarks.
Good afternoon. Thank you to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, National Alliance to End Homelessness, and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities for hosting this important webinar on Housing First and for inviting me to join you. I'm honored to represent California's 44th Congressional District, and I'm proud to be a co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on Homelessness. The caucus is intended to use our strength in numbers to advocate in Congress for critical housing programs. Housing First is vital to successful reentry. In the United States, nearly 80 million Americans have either a conviction or an arrest record. These individuals face significant barriers to build a new life. One of the biggest obstacles is access to safe and stable housing. By using a Housing First approach, we emphasize their right to housing. We also move quickly to meet their basic human need for a safe place to call home. Once this necessity is met, Housing First programs empower individuals by choosing them, the ability to choose to participate in life-changing services such as mental health therapy and substance abuse treatment. This focus on autonomy and client choice makes it more likely that an individual will remain housed and get the help they need. Programs like these help ensure the formerly incarcerated are on a pathway to success. We must continue to strengthen these integral systems and support solutions to address the growing homelessness crisis. That's why I introduced the Returning Home Act. This bill provides funding to government and community organizations dedicated to breaking down barriers to housing for the formerly incarcerated through a Housing First approach. Funding from the Returning Home Act also allows these organizations to provide rental assistance and supportive services throughout the housing search, such as pre-release planning, housing placement support, and connections to other services, such as substance abuse treatment and employment assistance. Securing housing for our community members is not a partisan issue. We must work together across the aisle and build coalitions to make sure legislation like mine and others out there make it through Congress. That's why I'm proud the Returning Home Act is supported by a range of organizations that work on housing, criminal justice reform, and disability issues. We must continue to build support and reach out to members on both sides of the aisle to make the case disability issues. We must continue to build support and reach out to members on both sides of the aisle to make the case
It looks like we might be having a little bit of technical difficulties with just the end of the representative remarks. That's all right. Thank you so much to Representative Barragan. It wouldn't be a webinar in the digital era if there was not some sort of a small glitch, but we'll be sure that that is working when we send out the slides later after today's presentation. So thank you so much to Representative Barragan for those inspirational words and for all of her work on this important issue. We'll turn now to remarks from Anna Bailey, Senior Policy Analyst with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. Anna works on CBPP's Connecting the Dots, Bridging Systems for Better Health project, and will be providing an important primer on mass incarceration to help set the stage for our discussion today. Anna, welcome and thank you so much for joining.
Thanks, Kim, and hi, everybody. I'm not sure if I just messed up the screen share. There it is. So as Kim said, I'm a senior policy analyst on the Center on Budget, where I work mostly on affordable housing and homelessness policy. The intersection with the criminal legal system has come up repeatedly throughout my career. And so I'm just gonna start us off with some level setting on the status quo of incarceration trends from a national perspective. And then I'm gonna, of course, pass it off to others to get to the exciting part of how Housing First can help folks who've been impacted by the criminal legal system. And just a disclaimer that I cannot give you a comprehensive overview of all things mass incarceration in 10 to 15 minutes, but we just wanna make sure we have some context for that conversation. And I'm gonna be using a lot of really useful graphics that other organizations have created, and we'll include some links to other resources if you want to dive deeper into this part of the topic. And May, I'm going to ask you to move slides for me. So if you could go to the next slide, please. So to start off is just the scale of mass incarceration. The United States incarcerates more people per capita than any other nation, and that means nearly 2 million people are incarcerated in this country on any given day. As you can see from this chart, which is from the Prison Policy Initiative, that there's been a really steep increase in the incarceration rates in this country since the 70s and 80s, peaking in the mid-2000s. In the dark orange, you can see the incarceration rates in state prisons. The lighter orange is local jails, and the yellow are federal prisons. And only recently has there been a slight decline in incarceration rates, especially at the beginning of the pandemic. That's where you can see the lines dipping down further as part of the pandemic response. And it's really important to note that it's yet to be seen like how these trends will change moving forward. But these incarceration rates really only kind of give you a tip of the iceberg, because mass incarceration has a really wide ripple effect. It affects not just the people who are incarcerated, but their partners, their children, entire communities. And there's almost 4 million people who are under some kind of probation or parole, some kind of community supervision. And cumulatively, over time, having really high rates of incarceration means that there's really a large share of the population that has some kind of criminal record, and the estimates vary between 1 in 5 people in the country and 1 in 3 people in the country who have some kind of criminal record. And there's a whole lot of policy decisions that are behind this, and I'm not going to totally unpack that today, but just want to note, right, that there are decisions about what is a crime. Think about the war on drugs and the decision to criminalize substance use. There are long sentences that is often attributed to mass incarceration. Not only is it the volume of people, but that people are getting incarcerated for really long periods, as well as the decisions about enforcement, policing, and who's being targeted. That leads to these numbers. Next slide. It's also really important to think about who is being incarcerated. So I don't think it's going to be news to most of you that there are really dramatic racial disparities in who's incarcerated in this country, but I think it's nonetheless critical that we pause on that point to really reflect on the scale there, and that this is driven by systemic racism that's leading to these disparities. It's not happenstance. So in this slide, which is also from the Prison Policy Initiative, and their data analysis shows you that incarceration rates on the left hand, men by race, and on the right hand shows you incarcerations for women by race. And just to give you a sense of what these numbers mean, Black men are over 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white men, and American Indian, Alaska Native women are over 3 times more likely to be incarcerated than white women. And I think the disparities, it's not on this slide, but the disparities in drug-related arrests and convictions help to reveal how systemic racism is at play, because Black and white people, for example, use illicit or illegal substances at pretty similar rates, but Black people are much more likely to be arrested, convicted of drug crimes, as well as face longer sentences. And there's a lot of other disparities at play, including around disability and income as well. Next slide. So I also wanted to highlight where people are incarcerated, what kind of facility, prison or jail. It's important to kind of understand that nuance. And this graphic, there's a lot of detail on here, but a couple of things I want you to take away from this graphic which is looking at a slice in time on any given day, showing that most people who are incarcerated are being held in a state prison, followed by local jail, followed by federal prison. And this again reinforces that state and local policies are the primary driver of mass incarceration in the country. And I also wanted to just remind you, though, looking at this national level of data, it can mask what's going on with subpopulations, right? This is about everybody who's incarcerated, but these trends look different for different groups. For example, if we were looking at just women, women are more likely to be incarcerated in jails than state prisons. And then also, like I said, this graphic is just giving us a slice of time. And as you all know, a point in time analysis only tells you part of the story. So we need to think also, what are the trends over a longer period? So on the next slide, you can see that while on any given day, most people are being held in a prison, over the course of a year, more people are entering jail than are entering prison. And this reflects that people who are held in jails are usually there for short periods of time, often less than 30 days, while prison is on average multiple years of incarceration. So I just point this out to remind folks that a really large share of people who were impacted by the criminal legal system are entering it through the local jail system. Next slide. And finally, another key point around zooming in on jails in particular is most people who are held in jail actually haven't been convicted of an offense. That they're being held in pretrial detention, which usually means, not always, but usually means somebody is not able to afford to post bail, that they could be free if they could afford the cash bail. And this is another spot where some of the trends might have changed during the pandemic, but you can see that leading up to the pandemic, there had been a really big increase in pretrial detention over the last couple of decades. Next slide. So all of that was talking about incarceration itself, but we know that's just one way that people are affected by the criminal legal system. And after people leave a jail or prison, their lives can still really be disrupted. Not only are folks maybe trying to reunite with family, but also the criminal record in particular, if somebody has a conviction, can have lasting effects that we often call collateral consequences. So this can include a litany of consequences like employment discrimination that employers in most places can refuse to hire somebody who has a record. It can mean debt, that people have fines or fees or other debt that is accumulated while they were incarcerated. It can be barriers to education, accessing public benefits as well. Voting and civic participation can be impacted as well. And next slide, you can also, of course, we know that there are major impacts on people's access to housing. So not only can landlords in most places turn people away because from renting somebody because they have a criminal record, but as I'm sure other panelists will touch on, there are also federal programs that allow, or in some cases require, public housing agencies to deny housing vouchers or public housing to people with certain kinds of criminal records. which can also keep families leaving jail and prison from reuniting with families who might have assisted housing. Next slide. So what does this all mean for homelessness, right? What I just talked through, there's a whole lot of things that are stacked against people returning from incarceration or who have a criminal record. Not everybody who has a criminal record has been incarcerated, but it's a little surprised that people who have been incarcerated have much higher rates of homelessness than the general public, as the slide from the Urban Institute shows you, and that the risk of homelessness worsens for folks who've been incarcerated multiple times. Next slide. And this can help create a revolving door or cycle between homelessness and incarceration. This graphic highlights some data from Connecticut that most people who were incarcerated in the state had actually experienced, and who also experienced homelessness, were unhoused before they entered prison in the first place. So demonstrating that it can be a cycle or revolving door. Last slide. So finally, touching a little bit on the good news, we have an increasing number of studies that are showing that housing first strategies, like on this graphic is about supportive housing in particular, can be both highly effective in keeping people who have been incarcerated stably housed after they return to the community, but also can help to avoid future interaction with the criminal legal system and help people maintain their freedom by reducing interaction with police and law enforcement, reducing incidences of arrests and number of days that people are in jail. So it doesn't mean that there's not need for changes in the criminal legal system to end mass incarceration, but does reinforce that housing and services is indeed the solution to homelessness. So this was an information overload, a ton of information for you to absorb in a short time. And I know that my colleagues who are going to speak after me are going to also lift up some of the trends and characteristics and the interrelationship between mass incarceration and homelessness. But I will stop there and pass it back to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Anna. And for folks, just for folks on the call to know, we are going to be holding questions until the end after the panel as part of a panel discussion. So we are taking notes of the questions that you're leaving in the Q&A, and we'll circle back to those. But before we move on, I did just want to take a look at one question that was being asked just by a bunch of people, Anna, about the recency of the data being used, just folks pointing out that the data was from 2010. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little to that.
Yeah, so the data in some of these, I mean, it depends on which particular slide folks are talking about. Yeah, not all of this data or research is totally up to date. And part of that is because of how the pandemic really affected how, the decisions that states and localities were making around incarceration. I did try to include in this slide that information about where the data is from. So when folks look at the slides, you're welcome to look at the original sources and the folks who compiled this information.
Awesome, thank you, Anna. And I'll just add a quick link to the chat. Our colleagues at the Prison Policy Initiative do a lot of this research on, stats surrounding incarceration. They do have some statistics published in 2023, but like Anna said, just keep in mind that a lot of the information that we're getting has been really impacted by the pandemic and some of the policy decisions that were made around there. So drop the link in the chat to additional information. But again, we'll also be following up after this webinar with more resources. Thank you so much, Anna. And stick around because we will be bringing you back on for the Q&A at the end. I am now going to, it doesn't look like Richard Cho has been able to join yet. So we are going to plow right ahead and move on to our next speaker, Victoria Jennings. All right, so Victoria is a supportive housing analyst at the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. In her role, Victoria administers home tenant-based rental assistance for formerly incarcerated people and the Indiana Housing First program for people with serious mental illness or substance use disorder who are experiencing housing instability. Victoria, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, Kim, and good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to share with you this afternoon about Indiana's work to use the Housing First model to support people impacted by the criminal legal system. So as Kim mentioned, my name is Victoria Jennings, and I work on supportive housing initiatives at the Indiana Housing and Community Development Authority. IHCDA is the state housing finance agency, and we administer over 30 federal and state programs that increase housing opportunities for Hoosiers and promote community development across the state. So the agency's embrace of the Housing First model started about 15 years ago when we initiated a partnership with CSH, the Corporation for Supportive Housing, to provide training on Housing First principles to partners who are interested in developing quality permanent supportive housing. So these efforts have resulted in the development of about 52 projects and more than 1,500 units, which end homelessness for roughly 275 people each year. We have developed new programs since then using the Housing First model because we know it works. We have seen really positive results from these projects and know that the Housing First model is really the way that we end homelessness in our communities across the state. So today I'll briefly share a little bit about two of our Housing First programs that specifically serve individuals that have been incarcerated. So the first is our Rapid Rehousing Program, and then the second is a permanent supportive housing program, which is currently in our planning stages. So I'll just share briefly about that. So in 2018, we launched a statewide rapid rehousing program exclusively for households where at least one member has been incarcerated. So this is called our Home TBRA program because we use Home Investment Partnerships Program tenant-based rental assistance as the subsidy. So this program was born out of new data being released at the time, showing that individuals involved in the criminal legal system were significantly more likely to become homeless during their lives after that involvement than the general public, and that individuals experiencing homelessness were more likely to become involved in the criminal legal system if they had not been already, thus increasing their vulnerability and their barriers to becoming housed. So some of that data that Anna talked about, especially that revolving door, is data that we looked at when thinking about how we should design this program and what those needs were. And then additionally, the state of Indiana sees higher incarceration rates than many other states. So this additional barrier of past criminal legal system involvement was something that we had already been seeing in people that we were serving in our other housing work and had been hearing from partners was a significant barrier for several years. So we knew that this was a priority that needed to be addressed. So we launched a program in 2018 and decided to use a portion of our Home Investment Partnership Program funds to provide tenant-based rental assistance to maximize choice and flexibility. Our eligibility criteria was at the time, and still is, that households may be eligible if they include either a member that is exiting incarceration within 6 months and at risk of homelessness, or if the household is experiencing homelessness and includes one member that is formerly incarcerated. So we chose that timeline of 6 months because it aligned with the Indiana Department of Corrections reentry timeline. So at 6 months, they begin the reentry process where they begin looking for community supports for individuals who are reentering. So we wanted to make sure that at the very beginning, when they started that process, if they were in need of housing and at risk of homelessness upon release, we could be involved in that process and be a potential resource. There is an additional requirement set by the funding source that households' income cannot exceed 60% AMI, but otherwise there are not any additional eligibility criteria imposed, and we do not screen people out for credit, rental, eviction, or criminal history. And I will say, to Anna's point, we do look at incarceration and not conviction history. So we do grant these funds out because we are a statewide agency located in Indianapolis, and it is not feasible for us to provide the quality of services needed to do that housing navigation, robust service provision from Indianapolis to these households. So we rely on those community partnerships. So since the program launched, we've granted about $4.5 million to 10 organizations across the state to administer the program in their jurisdiction. So this has been about 18 grants. This has worked very well because our program partners are obviously just the most informed about the needs in their area. So we work together with these program partners to develop prioritization plans for serving the most vulnerable in their community or those who cannot be served by existing programs. So we ensure that this program is complementary and meets the needs of their community. It was incredibly important that we use the Housing First model for this program because the individuals served encounter such high barriers to housing and are often excluded from other programs. So first, for this program, housing is affordable and available without requirements. So the program can pay security and utility deposits and ongoing rental assistance, and all participants are required to contribute 30% of their income towards rent. There are no service or sobriety requirements. And then the tenant-based rental assistance as the subsidy really allows a significant amount of choice. So all of our program partners work really hard to develop relationships with landlords in their communities. So there is a portfolio of second chance landlords willing to rent to program participants, immediately upon their release or enrollment in the program. But our program participants or our program grant recipients also work very closely with participants to help them identify a different unit if it's a better fit for their needs. So if it is closer to their family, to services they need, a job that maybe they identified while they were incarcerated or after release, or if it's just an area more conducive to their well-being. So if there's a community that they really do not want to live in or do want to live in, they work with them to use that subsidy in that area, in a unit in that area. We are as flexible as the funding source allows with permitting participants to live in the type of housing and living situation that they prefer, because we believe that participants are experts in what they need for their recovery. And if they say that a unit is not going to work for them, they are likely right. So the unit just must be priced reasonably and pass an inspection. And then finally, with services are of course offered on a voluntary and individualized basis, but the services are required to be offered by the provider, but they do not have to be accepted by the participant. We have seen service engagement rates across these projects are usually 100%, meaning that every participating household has opted to receive some type of supportive service at least once during their term of assistance. And I think the key here is that the services that are eligible have been very diverse, and our program partners are very skilled in connecting participants to the services that they need during re-entry or exit from homelessness. We have really witnessed across our programs how essential the provision of quality and robust services are to people's long-term housing stability. And so to increase our partners' capacity to provide these quality services, we actually released supportive services along with the rental assistance funding in our last grant making round. So this funding was made possible because the American Rescue Plan Home Investment Partnership Program funding included a new activity for supportive services. And so we allocated part of that funding to supportive services for this program to make sure that our program participants continue to receive those necessary reentry services. And then also that our program partners continue to have the capacity to provide those services as they collaborate with us. So since the program started, we've served about 400 households comprised of more than 600 individuals. It's about an even mix of those coming from homelessness or severe instability versus those entering the program from incarceration. We have started studying a sample of our projects for which we have the most robust data, and have seen that the rates of return to jail or prison from those who have entered from jail or prison while they were enrolled in the program is at about 3% over the past 5 years, which we consider successful compared to the statewide recidivism rate of over 30%. And then the return rates for those who enter the program from homelessness. So that would be those who have been previously incarcerated, but were not incarcerated immediately prior to entering the program, is about 7.5%. So we're working to improve data quality and better measure exactly how our program is performing, but we're hopeful that these preliminary results demonstrate that we're providing successful interventions to reduce systems involvement. So very briefly, switching gears and talking a little bit about our newest initiative in the reentry space. Last year, IHCDA collaborated with the Indiana Department of Corrections to apply for a Second Chance Act grant, which was focused on providing permanent supportive housing to individuals with a substance use disorder exiting the corrections system who are at moderate to high risk to reoffend. So we at IHCDA were very excited when we saw this solicitation because it seemed like a good next step for us to take programmatically, given our experience providing permanent supportive housing and reentry housing using the Housing First model. So we were luckily awarded this grant and are currently in the planning phase, which we anticipate will last through the end of the year. But this will be a localized project serving individuals exiting to a specific zip code in Indianapolis that DOC has identified as a priority for strategies to reduce recidivism. So we have partnered with a nonprofit organization based in that community that has a long history of serving the neighborhood. And we have committed to allocating them at least 30% of the funds to provide services to these individuals. So they are on our planning committee, and we're working together with them to shape the project to make sure that it aligns with the community's needs and the community's goals and their strategic plan, and also to draw on their expertise. So I don't have any numbers to share with you yet about on this project or about, since we're still on the planning phase, but we're really looking forward to launching this project and developing these new partnerships. And then hopefully we can maybe come back in the next couple of years and share some results with you about how this Housing First initiative has worked for us. But that is a brief summary of our work in this space, and I'll turn it back over to Kim. But thank you all so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Victoria. And thank you to folks in the audience who are submitting their questions to the Q&A. We will be circling back at the end of our panel to do a full-blown Q&A session with all of our panelists. I'm happy to report that we have been joined by Dr. Richard Cho, Senior Advisor for Housing and Services at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. As a Senior Advisor to HUD Secretary Marsha Fudge, Richard helps set HUD's policy agenda and strategy for solving homelessness. In particular, Richard has been foundational to advancing policies that help increase access to assisted housing and services for people with disabilities, older adults, and people impacted by the criminal legal system. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me, Kim, and apologize for my holdup. First of all, I want to just thank the National Low Income Housing Coalition and the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the Center for Budget for this particular webinar, but also for just this entire webinar series focused on Housing First. I want to just note that addressing the housing needs of people who are involved and impacted by the criminal justice system is a top priority for Secretary Fudge and for HUD. And that's really driven by a number of things. First and foremost, we know that the people who have been disproportionately impacted by the criminal justice system are people who are Black and Brown, and to some degree, people who are Indigenous, and that we have had many decades of policies that have led to a disproportionate impacts on those populations. Mass incarceration has, in particular, been a policy and set of practices that have really impacted communities of color. And that has also trickled into housing policies where the fact that a person has a criminal record and has past involvement in the criminal justice system has decreased people's chances of obtaining housing, both on the private market, but also to federally assisted housing. Back in the 1990s, there were a number of laws that were passed that seek to try to restrict access to HUD programs in particular for people who have criminal justice involvement. But we also know, and what I think drives our interest in wanting to really address the barriers and also the the housing needs of people who are involved in the criminal justice system is the fact that we know and have compelling evidence that shows that when you provide people with safe and stable housing, that actually reduces their chances of committing crimes and becoming involved in the criminal justice system in the future. And that we also know that people who are experiencing homelessness often end up getting more involved in the justice system because of the fact that all of the things that they engage in happen to be outside. And so there's a greater chance that they will be arrested or picked up for things that lead them to further involvement in the criminal justice system. And so about a year ago, Secretary Fudge, looking at certainly the impact on communities of color, but also on the fact that we know that housing actually contributes to public safety. And in fact, decreasing people's access to housing and housing assistance actually threatens public safety. It actually increases people's chances of recidivism and further involvement in the justice system. Secretary Fudge charged HUD to conduct a comprehensive review of the ways that our policies, our regulations, and our guidance documents can all be made in line to actually reduce barriers to entry for people who have criminal records, as well as to look at ways that our programs can better create housing opportunities for people who are re-entering the community from prisons or jails. And so over a several month period, principal leaders at HUD conducted a comprehensive scan of our regulations, our guidance documents, and our policies. And what essentially we found was that we send an inconsistent message with respect to our regulations and our guidance, where we've, I think, left the laws that exist to be interpreted in ways that actually leads to greater denials and barriers for people who have criminal records than really needs to be. Certainly, we understand that it's the responsibility of people who administer our programs locally, public housing authorities and housing owners. They have a responsibility certainly to ensure that their residents are safe and that their HUD-assisted properties are free from crime. But somewhere along the way, the message was sent in, I think, the regulations and laws were misinterpreted such that people were being denied, kind of automatically denied access to public housing or housing vouchers or multifamily programs simply because they have a criminal record, even when they pose no danger or risk of committing crimes in the future or other threats to health or safety. And so out of that review, HUD has decided, and Secretary Fudge has charged us to undergo changes to our regulations that would send a clear message that people should not be automatically denied access to public housing, housing vouchers, or multifamily housing simply because they have a criminal record, but rather people should be looked at as whole people. No person should be judged based on the worst mistake they've ever made, but rather on all the things that they're engaged in. And so we are in the process of developing a notice of public rulemaking that we hope to publish very soon, where we will make changes across a number of different regulations that sends that clear message that no one should be automatically denied access to HUD's programs simply because they have a criminal record. And also that that any public housing agencies or housing owners should conduct an individualized assessment that really looks at the full set of circumstances. First, if there is a conviction that they're looking at, is that recent? Second, is it a relevant criminal conviction relevant to making, a potentially endangering the health, safety, or peaceful enjoyment of HUD-assisted housing by other residents? And then third, are you taking into account all of the other potential mitigating factors? Is the person engaged in employment? Are they a member of community organizations? Is there other evidence that they have been rehabilitated, engaged in substance use treatment services, or participating in their faith community or other community organizations? And to really look at that whole picture before anyone is denied housing assistance. And really, the goal is to try to make our programs more inclusive of people who have criminal records. So that is something we are looking forward to publishing soon. That notice of public rulemaking will propose a number of changes to our regulations. And at the point in which we publish that NPRM, we would invite lots of public comment to tell us whether or not we've actually done a good job of ensuring that our programs are inclusive as possible, while still allowing for housing owners and PHAs to do some level of screening to ensure that they are making HUD-assisted housing safe. But again, we believe that providing housing opportunities to people who've been impacted by the criminal justice system is what actually contributes to public safety, not the other way around. And then the other thing I'll just note is we're also taking a number of other steps beyond just changing our regulations. We'll be developing additional guidance and technical assistance documents on ways that PHAs and housing owners can conduct individualized assessment to really look at criminal records in a very narrow way to assess whether or not they do predict potential future criminal activity that would endanger health or safety. And then we also are working with a number of partners to develop technical assistance products that help show how HUD programs, such as continuum of care resources, such as housing vouchers, can actually be used to create and proactively create housing opportunities for people who are reentering the community, and highlighting a number of examples where that's already been done to date. Also, we'll note that later this month, at the end of June, HUD will be co-hosting a national reentry housing symposium that we are co-hosting along with our partners at the Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Assistance, and that is put together by the Council of State Governments Justice Center. It is an invite-only event that will happen over 2 days, but where we will be featuring a number of ways that communities are already using HUD programs, as well as Department of Justice resources, such as what was already mentioned, the Second Chance Act, to create housing opportunities for people who are reentering the community, as well as modifying their policies to increase access to HUD programs and other housing opportunities. Just want to reiterate, this is one of the top priorities for Secretary Fudge, is to ensure that we are doing what we can to reverse the negative impacts of the criminal justice system, which has really harmed a number of Black and Brown communities across this country, and where we are doing everything we can to ensure that people have access to the very things that enable them to be productive members of the community and have the greatest opportunities to succeed and thrive. With that, I'll close there, and then I'll stick around for further questions. Kim, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Richard. And thank you for sticking around for our panel discussion at the end. Next, it is my pleasure to introduce Veronica Lewis, Director of Homeless Outreach Program, Director of the Homeless Outreach Program Integrated Care System, or HOPICS, in Los Angeles, California. In her role, Veronica oversees over $65 million in annual funding for multi-service programs that provide permanent housing, as well as mental health services, substance use disorder treatment, reentry support, and trauma-focused services to people experiencing or at risk of homelessness. Under her leadership since 2011, HOPICS has permanently housed thousands of people, including more than 5,000 families experiencing homelessness. Veronica, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here with you all today. If we can go to the next slide, please, and the next one. And so you heard our name is long, but Integrated Care System is a part of our name because housing first is not housing only. We believe everybody deserves a home, and that we wrap our arms around folks once they are stabilized so that we can support them and all the other needs that they have. Next slide. So HOPICS is one of the largest homeless and housing providers in Los Angeles County, and we're actually 35 years old this year. We serve a part of Los Angeles County that has some of the most highest density neighborhoods, as well as the census tracts with the lowest or very high poverty rates, and all kind of other disparate outcomes, including overrepresentation in homelessness, overrepresentation in incarceration, you name it. We work in 3 major systems of care, which is relevant because obviously the populations intersect, and many folks that are returning home from prison and jail and maybe have been home for a very long time, but are still struggling to stand up on their feet, all work across these systems. And so we're naturally a reentry service provider. We provide behavioral health services, which I'll go into in a little bit. And as I said, obviously we're a homeless and housing provider. It's important to note that more than 40%, and it's creeping up, I think, of maybe half now, of the people that work for us are people with lived experience. Either they're formerly homeless, formerly incarcerated, former or current consumers of mental health, and are in recovery from some type of addiction. We also have a lot of paraprofessionals, and so they may have lived experience, but they also have a certificated in our state. The substance use counselors is a certificate program, and so we have a lot of those folks. And also increasingly in our state, they now have a formal certificate program for peers, in particular for folks that are doing community health work in the reentry space. And so we consider them paraprofessionals as well. And then we also have clinical social workers, medical doctors, and everything along the gamut of what you would need for behavioral health. And primarily the folks that work for HOPICS look like me. We're Black and brown because that's what the community looks like. And so we're primarily folks with that are people of color at all levels of the organization, and the lived experience actually sits at all levels of the organization as well. Next slide. So our behavioral health work includes, we're outpatient mental health clinic for all adults, and one of just, I think across the country, one of just maybe 50 or so trauma recovery sites. I'm sorry, it skipped. Can you go back? I don't know why I jumped ahead. It seems to be on the timer. I'm sorry. Can you go back to the behavioral health slide? Sorry about that. And maybe pause it. So we are just one of, over 24 trauma recovery centers. And then I think, and again, in the country, it's about 50 now who are providing support and services to victims or witnesses of violent crime. I know that seems like an anomaly to be doing both reentry and serving victims, but it's not. It all goes hand in hand. And then we're an outpatient substance use provider. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that really intersects with people that are just returning back into the community within 48 hours of release. And we also provide recovery bridge housing, which is like a step down for people who have been in residential programs who do not have a safe space to return home to. Would you like me to pause? Sorry about that. Okay, who don't have a place to return to if they're trying to practice abstinence as a part of their recovery. And we are a huge provider of harm reduction services, primarily on the streets, serving over 30 encampments, taking supports to people who are actively using drugs to try to stop them from dying while they're doing so, or contracting diseases that could lead to their death. Next slide. And so our reentry focused services are intensive case management services. And so this could be for people who were recently released. And again, as we know, because folks returning home are often facing housing and employment discrimination, even if people have been in the community for a couple of years, we still provide wraparound support to them to try to improve their economic and housing stability. We also participated in the first Los Angeles County LEAD program, the Law Enforcement Assisted Diversion Program, essentially, which was a misdemeanor diversion program for people who continue to cycle in and out of jail related to using drugs and or being engaged in sex work. And so we wrapped our arms around them. There was housing attached, and we actually created a house specifically for people who were engaged in sex work, a safe place. And we stabilized them to stop the cycling in and out. And obviously, as they saw fit, addressed the substance use needs wherever they were in terms of that part of their journey. And then we provide an array of pre-release supports to folks in federal, state, and local prisons. A lot of that, in local jails, a lot of that is unfunded, but there's a significant amount of legwork we do so that, as you know, when people are released, there is a lot of stuff that happens within the first 48 hours. There's even data that shows that folks are likely to overdose if they're using drugs within 48 to 72 hours from being released. And so we do a lot of legwork so people can understand what their plan is and have a safe place to come home when they get out, to reduce the likelihood of challenges and obviously recidivism. And then specifically, again, we do a lot of substance use support navigation based on what I just said for folks within 48 to 72 hours of them returning home. When they have to report to the probation offices, we're there at the probation office to provide support. Next slide. And so the homeless and housing portfolio, and so we have street-based engagement teams. A lot of folks that return home end up on the streets, unfortunately. And so we have street-based engagement teams that are out in the community 7 days a week. These are multidisciplinary teams. Obviously, the bulk of the teams are out. We have over 13 outreach teams. The bulk of them are out during the work week. And then, we have a few out on Saturdays and Sundays. But these multidisciplinary teams are made up of nurses, clinicians, mental health clinicians, substance use professionals, people who used to be homeless or in recovery themselves and are formerly incarcerated themselves, so peers, and then case managers. And they take support and services out to folks on the street, essentially to stop them from dying while living outdoors, to improve their quality of life, to address any chronic health conditions or prevent chronic health conditions, to meet their basic needs, and then naturally, obviously, to restore a sense of humanity and build rapport so that we can ultimately get them indoors. And then we also have, for people who are willing to walk indoors, we have access and triage centers. So anybody that's in a housing crisis can walk through one of our doors and receive air traffic control. Essentially, we immediately meet their food, health, and shelter needs, and then obviously link them to other supports, legal services, healthcare services, et cetera, that they may need. That includes a navigation center for people who are living outdoors, where they can shower, wash their clothes, do their laundry, store their belongings, and just restore a sense of dignity and allow people to be clean and use the restroom in a facility, et cetera. And then we have a huge portfolio of interim housing. And so we keep a lot of folks that have returned home within the last 6 to 12 months in our interim housing portfolio. We don't have a reentry specific interim housing, but on any given night, Topics is keeping over 2,500 people off the street in a variety of interim housing. Most of them are in single family homes or multifamily units. That also does include safe parking for people who are experiencing vehicular homelessness. And about 400 of those 2,500 people are kids or minors under 17 years old, because we have a lot of family homelessness in the region that we serve. Next slide, please. So we so let's talk about permanent housing. So I really appreciated the comments of my fellow panelists earlier. So one of the primary resources we use for for permanent housing is wrap housing, or in LA, they're beginning to call it time limited subsidy. There is no criminal background check, there's no exclusion. And so this is the primary resource we're using for most of the folks we're serving in the community. They get up to 24 months of assistance. Obviously, we pay security deposit, furniture, all those things. We do make some commitments to the landlords, obviously, and have more hands-on support and are at the houses more than we normally would be, more than the traditional one-time perma for populations that need additional support. And so that's for folks that we moved in directly from the street that may have been experiencing chronic homelessness, and also some of our reentry population. We also provide in our region, in our county, about 10 years ago, our Department of Health Services determined that homelessness was a health condition. And that allowed them to open up the levers to have significant investment in an initiative that's called Housing for Health, that is now serving thousands of people that have lots of barriers, chronic health conditions, chronic homelessness. There's no criminal background exclusion. So there's a significant number of people that have backgrounds that are part of it, and they get intensive case management services with a 1-to-20 ratio, and there's always a housing subsidy attached, whether that's long-term attached to one of the public housing authorities, or part of what the initiative did was put hundreds of millions of dollars into what we call a flexible housing subsidy pool. And so in lieu of only using vouchers and long-term subsidies, our county health department has created the flexible housing subsidy pool that pays medium to long-term rental assistance for this population that I just described. We work really closely with the two main housing authorities in our region, the city and the county of LA. And so one thing about our housing authorities, and we've had to advocate for it, as HUD has continued over the last 15 years to take out some of the exclusions for long-term subsidies or vouchers, our housing authorities thankfully have updated their administrative plans. And so essentially, for the most part, we're down to manufacturing meth and arsonists being primarily the only exclusions. And so we are able to, obviously there's a limited amount of vouchers, but we are able to attach folks that we're serving from the reentry community or the criminal legal system involved to these vouchers. Some of the emergency housing vouchers, we're able to attach them to. We had a couple that were denied, but again, primarily it's the arson and the manufacturing of meth that are the main exclusions, but otherwise we are able to use this resource when it becomes available. And we're really looking forward to and hoping that Representative Betta Hahn's Returning Home Act moves forward, because that would be an important resource for our communities. We also provide eviction prevention support, and we can move to the next slide. So a couple of things that we do in addition to the direct services that I just mentioned, again, because we want to provide wraparound supports, that we have some important partnerships where we are taking supports into other office spaces. And so I won't go through all these, but I'll highlight a couple of them that are relevant to the workforce. And so we are co-located in multiple probation departments that are also considered hub sites, so that people are having to report about 12 years ago in California, we have the Justice Realignment. I know it's happened in other communities whereby a lot of the community supervision is happening locally, even for people that are returning from state prison. And so a good chunk of the folks are on some version of probation as opposed to parole. So most people are having to report within 48 hours of their release. And so our teams are housed at these sites. In some cases, solely providing substance use navigation support. So doing a pre-screening and doing the actual navigation and hand holding until somebody gets into whatever the appropriate level of treatment is. And then also at some of the probation sites, there's a pilot where there's kind of like a one-stop shop with all these different resources. We're a part of that. Not only are we providing the substance use, but we actually have a satellite access, homeless access center at the probation site where we're doing all the things that I described that we do at the access centers. We also are co-located at a couple of courthouses. And so we're doing some substance use navigation stuff there, but we also serve as a tool for both courtrooms that have formal diversion programs, but also for courtrooms who may, where the judge may just decide they want to explore community-based options. And then we're also co-located, which is relevant to the population at our Department of Social Services, which provides welfare, food stamps, and all those kind of things, Medi-Cal, et cetera. And we have these substance use and mental health services co-located at some of our interim housing sites as well. Next. And then in terms of the housing stuff, some of the additional places we're housed at where we are able to capture this population that are somewhat non-traditional, if you will. So we are co-located or have, even if we don't have actual office hours and space, we have very involved collaborations with hospitals and other institutions. We're co-located at some of our elected officials' offices, providing support in those spaces. I already talked about the housing piece we do at probation. We're increasingly broadening our net to connect to places of worship, because a lot of times they are the first safety net for people returning home to the communities or where people's family members are. And so we do a lot of work with places of worship to try to provide support to them, either at their site or being on call for them. We're increasingly working with small businesses as well, and ad hoc locations as needed. Next slide. I think that concludes my presentation. So thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for joining us, Veronica, and for the extremely vital work that you're doing. Just really incredible work that can really serve as a model for the rest of the country. So we will now turn to Taylor Newbell, who is the founder and executive director of Who Speaks For Me, a national nonprofit that she founded while incarcerated. Who Speaks For Me connects women, and in particular LGBTQ women, exiting incarceration with affordable, stable housing and wraparound services to ensure they have the support and stability needed to thrive after incarceration. Taylor is credited with coining the term trauma to prison pipeline, which recognizes the inextricable link between trauma and incarceration, and has dedicated her work to ensuring people incarcerated and those leaving incarceration receive trauma-informed services and housing. Welcome, Taylor, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. You sound great.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure because it seemed to go down a little. Hi, I'm Taylor Newbell. I'm the founder and executive director of Who Speaks For Me. And as was stated, I designed this program, or a skeleton version of it, while I was incarcerated. And the housing piece just came together for us in November of 2022. We were given a generous seed grant to provide housing to 5 returning citizens that identify as women and or LGBTQ people. We rent the apartments, and then we sublet them to our participants for up to 1 year at no cost. We provide $100 weekly stipend, cash, connection to mental health, substance use abuse treatment, as well as individualized care. I want to just pause for a moment and show a video of our first participant, and then I'll explain more about our Housing for All. Mary, you got your own place. How do you feel? Oh, Mary, come give her a hug. Mary, come on in. Come on in, Mary. Come on down, love. Come on in. This is your place. Come on, let's walk through. That's the extra room, but this is your living room. And come on, Mary. Come on, Mary. Come on down. This is your guest bathroom right here. It's got a little shower, toilet, sink. And this, Mary, is your bedroom. Oh, shit. There's a TV, a desk. Come look, Mary. There's washer, dryer. There's a sink. And then come look at your bathroom. Oh, shit. Go, Mary. Go, Mary. Go, Mary. Mary, welcome home. Mary, look, there's flowers for you. There are your keys. Pick up your keys. Oh, shit. There are your keys. These my keys. Those are your keys, Mary. These my keys. We got you some flowers. We got some food to eat. And, some gift cards. Smell your flowers. They smell so good. It's your place. Where are you? You made it happen. I got my own Who Speaks For Me made it happen in our funders. Yeah. Mary. Yeah. It's okay. Yeah. Yeah. How's it feel? Yeah. That's all you can say is yeah? Yeah. Did you have a hard time sleeping last night?
I was up at 4 o'clock this morning.
Doing what? Look at me.
I was up at 4 o'clock this morning. I looked at the clock. I said, it's time for them to come get me. So, since it wasn't time for you to come get me,
What'd you do?
I fixed me a cup of coffee. Then I went outside. I said, well, I'm going to go outside and I'm going to see the true dawn come up. And I went and I looked at the true dawn come up. I even took a picture of it.
You did?
Yeah, I took a picture of the sky this morning.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and then I went back in. I turned the TV on. Then I looked. I said, wait a minute. She said, always check my emails. So I checked my emails. I said, no, don't have none from them yet.
Because you thought we were going to be able to True Dawn.
Yeah. Yeah, so.
I had to get up at 9 o'clock to give electricity to the people that are repairing the brick on my house. And that was too early for me. So nobody True Dawn.
See.
Oh, that's beautiful.
See, I took that this morning. Yeah. But
The
my
morning
daughter.
of your new home.
Hey, Dad, check it out, baby. I'm gonna let you lay on the couch now, because I got my check. Okay?
How you feel, Mary?
I feel good. I feel good all over. I'm getting a massage.
Mary, you deserve this and so much more. Do you know that?
Thanks to you.
No, thanks to Who Speaks For Me.
Free as in the ocean now, yeah, to set me free. Now I need to find release. Set me to the open sky.
So we can stop it now. So every time I see that, I cry. Mary did 33 years. She went in when she was 22. She came home when she was 55. She never had her own place until we housed her in November of 2022. She was 64 years old. She wanted to be housed before Thanksgiving, so we put her in a temporary place because her permanent place, which you saw at the very end of the video, was being updated. Mary is a unique case because we partnered with the mayor's office in DC on LGBTQ affairs, and we got a housing voucher for her. So now we're turning her rent into guaranteed income, because you can imagine doing 33 years, there's nothing there for retirement. And we work with Mary on a whole host of things. For example, when you go to prison for 33 years and you're 22, you don't know how to cook, you don't know how to shop. And so we're working with her on that. We have 5 participants and they vary, and it's a really good kind of sector of people. So we have Mary, who's a gay woman. We have a gay man who's from Puerto Rico. We have a trans woman who's African American. We have a white woman who's straight and a Black woman who's a mom of 2 kids. So those are our participants right now. This is a 1-year program. Like I said, we give them cell phones, we connect them with services. Mary wants to be a hospice worker, so we're looking to get her certified in that. We have another client who works for the government as a crossing guard, but we're trying to shift her into a different job with the DC government. So this is what we do, and it's why we call it Housing for All. When I designed this program, it was largely based on Mary's story, because I spent my last 9 months incarcerated at the prison where Mary was. And I had my own housing woes. When I came home, I was given a voucher because I have PTSD and acute anxiety. And I was living with a voucher, and I found it very difficult to navigate because we have banned the box in DC. But I always say you can ban the box, but you can't ban Google. So even though landlords are not allowed to ask you prior to giving you a conditional offer, if you've been incarcerated in a certain amount of time, they are allowed to Google you. They are allowed to say, we're going to ask you for your rental history. And if you've been incarcerated for 33 years or 19 or 27 years, like some of our clients, of course, you don't have a rental history. So you can ban the box, you can give vouchers, but there's so much more to successful housing. We have no rules about going to their place to check out. They meet once a week, either Zoom or if they want to at their house with our outreach coordinator. We don't inspect their place. We don't care what they do with the place as long as they don't damage it. We give them access to services, but we don't demand it, because a true housing first model is housing with no strings attached. There's no drug testing. We don't replicate carceral spaces. We really are saying if we can give people, I know when I came home, if someone had given me a beautiful place like Mary, my nonprofit would have gotten off the ground a lot sooner, and I wouldn't have lived in abject poverty. I wouldn't have been homeless. I wouldn't have been subjected to some domestic violence with a roommate. Things would have been very different. But here we are, right? And I would never redo it the way it was done when I first came home. But I'm glad that I can say when Who Speaks For Me is providing housing for our clients, if I wouldn't want to live there, they don't go there. We have things that are like, if suppose you don't want to be in the program anymore, right? And you want to leave, it costs a bit of money to leave. So the first year we built in anybody that we want to exit because they're not working out or they want to exit. We give them up to $5,000 to relocate, and we will serve as their landlord. I really don't know what else to say except for that it's so important that when people come home, that they're not put in places that are like replicating incarceration. That's so important. When I was in a reentry home, when I came home, they wanted to drug test. They wanted me to go to NA meetings, and I don't have substance use disorder. I was in therapy for my mental health. I remain in therapy for my mental health. I am a lesbian. So a lot of the questions I saw about queer women and so on and so forth, Who Speaks For Me works only with women and LGBTQ people. We are overrepresented. We receive more time than the straight community, and we have multiple marginalized identities. And so this is what we do. We are serving a community of people who are left out of the conversation. The number of women incarcerated has increased by 800% in the last 40 years. And we aim to create alternatives to incarceration by using trauma as a mitigation, as well as when people come home, recognizing the trauma before, during, and post-incarceration. And with that, I'll wait for the Q&A. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Taylor, and thank you for that video. I had the honor of meeting Mary at an event for Who Speaks For Me, and it was right before she was able to get her permanent housing, her permanent apartment, and watching that video was just so moving and so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. And before we open it up to Q&A, Taylor, I did just want to touch base with you because we're getting a few questions in the chat about how folks can find Who Speaks For Me and help support their work. So is there a website or anything that you would want folks to be directed to? Oh, you're muted.
So we were using Squarespace for the last few years, and our site crashed 2 months ago. It'll be up and running, I believe. Fabina, my director of communication, is watching this in development. Fabina, I believe we're going to be up and running from our website in the next couple of days. We have a presence on social media, Facebook, IG, as well as Twitter. And I will drop our info at Who Speaks to Me in the chat. And Fabina's texting me right now to say tomorrow morning the website will be live. And so I will drop in the chat that information. And we would love people to be involved. We are really seeking funding so that we can continue this program. So we've applied for a pretty large grant from BJA and a couple other resources. And I just want to say one more thing. It is cheaper to house people in their own apartments than in a communal setting. And so I'm dropping everything in the box now, and then we can, is there anything else?
No, we'll open it up to a broader Q&A, but just wanted to make sure we had the chance to plug Who Speaks for Me and make sure folks know where to access your website and find out more information. Awesome. So we will move right along into a Q&A discussion. Thank you all so much for taking the time to submit your comments. We have certainly a lot of questions in the chat, so we will go through and try to answer as many of them as possible. So first up, if all of our speakers could come on camera, that would be great. Some of these are going to be a little bit more relevant to folks than others, but everyone can feel free to chime in. So our first question, how do your programs meet the unique needs of individuals exiting incarceration? So for example, how do you meet the needs of people living with substance use disorder, or those who have fixed incomes, or who need to be connected to resources like Social Security or food assistance?
Who is that question for?
I think it's more relevant to, say, Veronica, Victoria, and you, Taylor, just about how you connect other folks to other supportive services that they might need after exiting incarceration.
Yeah, I'll start if you want me to. Obviously, I described our integrated care. And so, it was on the slide, but I didn't say we're the lead agency for the sub-region of the coordinated entry system in LA County, serving South Los Angeles, Compton, Linwood, and those communities. And so collaboration is at the core of what we do. And so we're constantly connecting folks for those resources. I also have to say, obviously, there's a scarce amount of resources. Let me just be clear. We can't get everybody access to all the resources that they need, but our reentry program, which everybody that works there, including the program manager and everybody else, is formerly incarcerated. And so there is, even though they bring other experiences in education, potentially to the mix, their lived experience helps them understand, and the person-centered approach and listening to the folks help us support. But there's a significant amount of income generation support there, obviously with employment and earned wages being the primary thing. But we have connections to both public and private agencies, and that's a big part of our work, linkages. And if we can't, then obviously that's why we're advocating and working alongside folks like the representative to try to get legislation passed to get more resources. But we do a lot of linkages, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of going to appointments with folks, right? And just getting creative. And there's a whole, unfortunately in this space, there's a whole unfunded safety net. I don't know if it's like that in other people's community, but in LA, you got all these folks who came up doing great work like Taylor is doing, but they're largely unfunded or underfunded. And so we tap into and work closely with their grassroots and trusted community organizations and tap into them, and also are working to advocate to change contracting in our county so that those organizations actually can access more of the dollars as well. But we tap into the unfunded safety net of trusted messengers and community organizations as well.
Awesome. Victoria, please.
Sure. So our Home TBRA program, I mentioned, is a grant program. So when we grant out these funds, we are specifically funding projects where we know that holistic, comprehensive reentry services will be provided. So we specifically ask, are you planning to connect people to mainstream benefits? Can you provide referrals to, mental health and primary care services? So we're making sure that those connections are available. But then we also acknowledge that not everyone who provides housing has that infrastructure. And so when we're looking around the state to areas where there's need and making those connections, and we also offer to connect program partners to other partners in the area to make sure that they could have a robust application. So we're doing some of that work to make sure that the services that will be offered by these programs are comprehensive. And then when we're looking at our new permanent supportive housing project that we're planning to develop, up. I agree that collaboration is at the core. So we are working with a community-based organization that has been providing services to the participants that we plan to target for several years. So we're really drawing on that experience and making sure that we're providing culturally specific services to these individuals. And then we are also creating surveys to interview people with lived experience who maybe have returned to the criminal justice system, who are living stably in the community, and asking them, what services were you provided that were essential, or what services were you not provided that you needed, to make sure that we are contracting for those ahead of time and that they're provided.
Great, thank you, Victoria. And Taylor, just wanted to see if there was anything you wanted to add to that too.
I'm not sure. I didn't really grasp what was being asked. I don't know if I'm.
Oh, no, no worries. Just basically, how do you make sure that folks in your program have all of the assistance that they need? So stuff like connecting people to Social Security or food assistance, all those other important supportive resources.
So we have a housing outreach coordinator, and I meet with her once a week. And we're small, national in scope, but small in size. We're not heavy on the overhead of staff. And so our outreach coordinator meets with people once a week or more often if needed, and figure out exactly how to connect them to services. So for example, going back to Mary, Mary needs to connect with all kinds of doctors and things like that. She's gonna be 65 and she did 33 years in prison, and that's very hard on your body. So our housing coordinator just makes sure Mary is accessing the services. She knows how to navigate those systems with health insurance, with SNAP benefits and things like that. When it comes to our other clients, when they first come home, of course, they're not connected with SNAP or Medicaid. So we do provide gift cards for food. I don't know if you could hear me in the video. Before I told Mary to smell the flowers, I said, oh no, I left the gift certificates in the car, because we had gotten her gift cards to Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, and the giant food store here. So that's how we kind of combat that. We did have a client a couple of weeks ago. Having agency is really important, right? So if they choose to misuse their money and don't have food, they have to go to the food pantry, because a part of this is, now Mary would never send to a food partner or pantry, because Mary is the one that gets everything. But so the client was like, can you send me Instacart? Then the outreach coordinator came to me and I said, absolutely not. Find out what he did with his money, or tell him to reach out to the pantries, because you have to have agency, right? You have to use the program. We want you to use this program to create wealth. And wealth looks different for a lot of people. For me, when I was searching for housing, wealth looked like a safe place that I didn't want to leave, that when I walked up to it, it looked great. The neighborhood was safe. The landlord took care of things. So we're trying to teach people you have this money, you're working, you don't have to pay rent, you don't have to pay for your cell phone, you have to pay for your food. We help you with transportation, and we give you cash every week up to a year. So if somehow you spent all your money and didn't get yourself groceries, that's on you, right? And that is a really hard position for me to take, because I just want to be like, oh, but I learned in the enterprise working group not to be paternal. And that was something that I had, not being paternalistic, to step back and say, people have agency, they have choices, and we don't have to be everything to everyone, but we do our best to give a solid foundation. That's all.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So this next one, I think, is going to be for everyone, and it's about partnerships. So one of the kind of overarching themes that I think really comes out of all of the presentations that we heard from our panelists today is the importance of partnerships, both, on the ground and doing that work together in community, but also in federal agencies. So making sure that HUD is talking to DOJ and helping with that kind of coordinated reentry process. And so I'm wondering, could our panelists speak to kind of the importance of partnerships in both their work with directly impacted people and at kind of that higher, at that federal level, to make sure that people are no longer slipping through the cracks?
Well, Kim, I can speak certainly to the federal partnership. I mean, I think the federal partnerships that we have across federal agencies are really intended to try to help foster partnerships at the local level, which is really where the action's at. And I think Veronica, you said housing first is not housing only. It's absolutely about supportive services. I know Taylor and Victoria, you also noted that. And, HUD's role is primarily to provide housing assistance, but we also recognize that people need case management and assistance with activities of daily living, and frankly, just help navigating our very difficult to navigate public service systems. And so, we know housing related case management is really critical. And so we partner with Department of Justice and their Bureau of Justice Assistance. That's the grant making arm of DOJ, and they provide Second Chance Act grants. They provide grants for the Justice Mental Health Collaboration Program. And one of the things we'll be doing through the national symposium that I mentioned is to talk about how those HUD resources can be blended and braided with DOJ resources to be able to provide that combination of housing and services that makes housing supportive housing. And then likewise with HHS, so much of what we do is to partner with various HHS agencies to think about how can Medicaid, SAMHSA grants, and other resources, how can area agencies on aging and disability organizations also support efforts to support people to reenter the community. So, we're part of my role at HUD is actually to try to make sure we're partnering with those other federal departments that really have the resources and the funding that provides funds the supportive services, and make sure that we are doing everything we can to make our programs fit together with those other resources. But really, I think all of this is about fostering collaboration at the local level, so that whether you're in Indiana or DC or California or wherever, like you can figure out how to braid these resources together, at the local level to provide housing and services.
That's great. And also, just the idea of being able to braid those funding streams together in order to provide for the whole person, and in order to ensure somebody is getting all of the assistance they need is going to be so helpful. Just wanted to open it up to, Anna, go right ahead.
Super quickly, just as somebody who works at the intersection of a number of different policy issues when starting these kinds of partnerships for the first time with a different system or sector, really the starting point usually is just some 101 of helping the partner that you're reaching out to understand the homelessness system and how it's funded, how it operates in a very basic level, and vice versa, right? Coming in with an open mind of, okay, what is this other system? Where are they coming from? What are their constraints? And that can help just to make clearer where the common ground is. But I'm really interested in hearing Veronica, Victoria, and Taylor talk about partnerships too.
Yeah, thank you. I talked about it a little bit, but again, so just really quickly, we were literally founded by somebody who was living on Skid Row, a veteran who had ended up on Skid Row because of addiction. And he founded HOP at the time before the integrated care system came, by convincing the state officials who were trying to figure out what to do with Skid Row that the people who knew how to serve people well were the people who experienced it themselves. And so HOP was founded with people walking the streets of Skid Row in these bright gold shirts that said HOP, taking information and referrals and resources to people in the way that they would access them. And so collaboration and creating meaningful partnerships and helping people navigate those is literally at the core of who we are. And that permeates, even as we've grown and added all these pieces, it permeates throughout how we do our work. And so as the coordinated entry system lead, we're actually formally responsible for our sub-region of the County of LA for bringing the public and private partners together in a way that supports the unique nuances of the people that we're serving in our sub-region, but also, again, it's a core part of who we are. And so not only do we have over 25 subcontracts with some of those grassroots organizations I talked about who can't access the dollars we have, but we pass them through so we can do the work with them, either in different parts of the community, or just because they have a specialty, or just because they do great work and they can't access it. And we have over 90 collaborative partners that cover the different domains that are essential to the work that we do: legal aid, primary health care. We have a co-located Family Qualified Health Center in one of our access centers. We have legal aid co-located. We have a workforce center co-located. And so we try as much as we can actually to bring as many resources in-house, even if it's not full-time, through office hours, or as I talked about in my presentation, go to places. But one of the things that we do is listen to the people we serve and listen to the people that do the work. And when they tell us there's gaps, we actively figure out who's mission aligned and attach ourselves to those folks to fill those gaps.
Fantastic. Thank you, Veronica. And so we are running up right against time. I'm going to ask one more question from the chat or from the Q&A box about how you all identify housing providers and avoid the problem of, landlords who might not keep their housing up to code and make sure that you're, moving people into quality housing. Taylor, I saw you on mute.
I'll take that one. So, because we all know giving someone a house doesn't mean that it's a home. And I just want to say I have a beautiful house now that I'm buying, and I love my house. And it was a long time getting here, but people, I saw a lot of questions about like, how do we get the rental and the units like that? So I develop relationships. I'm a good storyteller. After I talk to people, I then will say, well, I went to prison for 4.5 years. And it's a real kind of come to the universe moment because they're like, you were in prison. And it's like, yeah. But that being said, we work with landlords. So like two of our clients live in like a building that, well, 2 separate buildings, but it's one landlord that owns it. And I have someone, they're actually working in my house right now, and their name is Collins. And if the landlords don't fix the place, I send Collins to fix the place, and we pay for it and we subtract it from the rent. It's also a way of teaching landlords, right? Like you have to respect the people that are in your property because you want them to take care of it, but also it's just the right thing to do. So that's how we deal with that. If we ever run into any issue with it, I'll just say to my clients, we're going to have to look and move you. But we haven't had that. Again, we've only been around doing this particular program since November, but I take it very seriously. Again, if I don't want to live there, none of our clients are going to live there. So even when our outreach coordinator is like, oh, we might have found a place here and there, I would say, well, now I have the time. Of course, if we grow like I want us to, I won't have that time. But now I have the luxury of saying, well, let's schedule time so I can go over to that place because we're only in the DC area right now. So that's how we do it. It's really just starting from like losing that attitude. Well, they should be grateful is really important, right? Nobody has to be grateful for housing. People are entitled to it, right? Housing for all means all of us. Our lives are better if we like where we live, if the environment is healthy. So it's never like you need to be grateful. It's, I really hope we're doing right by you. We really hope that this does what it needs to do. And if not, we'll figure it out.
Fantastic. And, just to that point, Taylor, everybody's lives are better when people have safe, quality, affordable, accessible housing that they need. Our communities are safer, our communities are stronger. Everything is better when we work together to solve these issues. It is 4:02. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists for joining. We are a little bit over time. I just have a couple quick housekeeping notes that I wanted to flag for folks. Of course, got other stuff to do. Feel free to hop off. And you can, check out my rambling conclusion to this on your own time. But just a couple things to flag. So first, our next webinar is going to be on Monday, July 10th at 2:30 p.m. It will address communications and messaging around homelessness and housing first. So please do register for that and join us for our next webinar. Thank you all so much for attending today as well. And then just one more thing to flag, Representative Andy Barr, who is a Republican from Kentucky, recently introduced the Housing Promotes Livelihood and Ultimate Success Act, also known as the Housing Plus Act. NLHC and our partners in the space strongly oppose this bill because it undermines federal, state, and local efforts to end homelessness by one, preventing HUD and local governments from prioritizing evidence-based solutions, and two, diverting scarce resources to outdated, ineffective, and costly strategies that are not proven to work. Under current law, HUD is required to use the best available evidence to prioritize proven solutions to homelessness, which allows HUD to adjust its policy in response to new research and findings. Since 2013, HUD has prioritized housing first approaches because it is the most effective approach to ending homelessness and ensuring people have long-term housing stability. Under the Housing Plus Act, HUD would be prohibited from prioritizing evidence-based solutions, and instead there would be a 30% set aside for homelessness funding for high barrier programs that, as evidence shows, are far less effective than Housing First. And in doing so, Representative Barr's bill would force local continuums of care to defund existing successful Housing First programs and instead use those scarce resources on poor performing programs that often have requirements that can actually pose a barrier to long-term housing stability and successful reentry. You can read our statement from national organizations opposing the bill at a link in the chat that Elena just dropped. And if your representative serves on the House Financial Services Committee, please do weigh in with them and urge them to oppose this bill. We have talking points that you can use that I believe Elena also dropped in the chat. You can use those talking points to engage with your members of Congress. We'll post a link to a list of members who serve on the Financial Services Committee as well as our fact sheet on the bill. And so that is it. Thank you for those of you who were able to stick around for the extra 5 minutes. Big, huge thank you to our incredible panelists for both joining us and for the amazing and vital work that they're doing to ensure people exiting incarceration and those with a conviction history are able to exit incarceration into safe, stable housing and really have a fair shot at restarting their lives. Thank you all so much for joining. Yeah, and that's it. Take care. Until next time.